Welcome to the second session, Gridded Plans and Architectures. Next to it expands on gridded historical and contemporary plans in town planning and architecture. They integrate approaches from landscape designs and religious studies respectively, and through these approaches, the lectures analyzes the usefulness of gridded design in the urban context. Far beyond the purely aesthetical considerations of such designs, it is shown how orthogonal layouts are tightly entangled with environmental considerations, as well as with culture, politics, and religious beliefs. Our first speaker, Professor Rego, was trained as an architect and urbanist and got his PhD from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid in Spain. He's a full professor at State University, a researcher in the Brazilian National Council for Technological and Scientific Development. His teaching is focused on modern architecture and town planning history. His interests concern the diffusion of foreign ideas on 20th century Brazil. He is currently working on transnational comparative studies focusing on Brazilian and African new capital cities. He wrote several books and publications and serves as a member of major professional forums, and his fascinating journey moves between the architectural and urban planning and the historical grid. So let us welcome Professor Renato Leão Rego. Hello, Professor.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for the introduction. Well, I'm speaking from the State University of Maringá in South Brazil. It's an honor and a privilege to be part of this conference. Thank you. I live in the north part of Paraná State, a region that was deforested, colonized, and urbanized in the first half of last century. Dozens of new towns were created from scratch, and the grid was the conspicuous planning tool. These towns were mainly designed by civil engineers according to the notion of town planning as urban art. By showing some layouts of these new towns, I will claim that a specialized grid revealed due to its particular relationship to natural setting and artistic features of the urban form. Later on, the pioneering agricultural frontier moved further to western North Brazil. Schools of architecture became more widespread, and by mid-century, when architects took the lead role in planning proposals, functionalist ideas prevailed. The grid then became less artistic and less specialized, lacking spatial quality. I will also provide visual examples to endorse this reasoning. The grid has been deemed as instinctive tool for creating new towns, for no other parceling scheme seems so easily outlined, yielding uniform plots plainly describable in deeds. It is advantageous from the commercial point of view, as it offers none of the problems that irregular plots and curved perimeters present to planners, who can easily calculate the area of standardized orthogonal shapes. However, the grid has been criticized for a calculated indifference to the natural setting, and has been taken as the physical equivalent of the laissez-faire economy, the perfect plan for the capitalist city, generating urban forms, is strong in private spaces, but weak in public ones. Moreover, its principle of order, regularity, simplicity, and practicality can become rigid and lack interest if mechanically applied. For the grid is neutral, non-hierarchical, and appear monotonous unless infused with special content, thus gaining individuality, hierarchy, and static appeal. The colonization scheme of northern Paraná State, the region where I'm talking to you from, applied straight lines to connect streams and ridges, the natural lines of the terrain. It thus easily defined more or less rectangular rural plots that had direct access to water and transportation, as roads were always built along the ridges. New towns in these regions, we can see the first of the new towns built here. New towns in this region were planned when town planning was being formed as a field of knowledge in Brazil. Engineering schools then offered regular courses on town layout based upon city beautiful lines and focusing on urban beauty, amid sanitation, and traffic issues. Thus, a sensitive design avoided the unfavorable abstract uniform grid, achieving considerable levels of legibility, identity, and interest. Therefore, different urban forms are noticed. I'll talk about this one now, which is the city of Rolandia. The city of Rolandia was shaped according to the site. The rationale for a grid orientation in this town was the railway and the curved perimeter, the curved perimetric avenue that encircled the plateau and preserved the adjacent streams. The focal point of the layout was the train station, from which 3 diagonal larger avenues lead to the town hall, church, and school in the city center, the cemetery on our left, and the sports facility on our right. The entire blocks reserved for those buildings, strategically positioned on the grid, created singular events in the urban tissue. The trident was a common artistic motive which established centrality, focal point, and suggestive views even in small urban settlements like this one on the screen. A similar solution can be found in Jussara, a small town on a flat terrain. Its gridded plan had a clear-cut central square on which 6 tree-lined avenues converge. Symmetry reinforced the artistic aspirations of the city layout. 4 public squares and the adjacent school and Catholic church specialized the otherwise indistinct grid. The design of Tamboara was based on a rectangular grid with a linear shape positioned on a ridge, along a ridge. At the core of the city, the civic center accommodates the church, the Catholic church, opposite the town hall, and symmetrical public squares between them. Diagonal tree-lined avenues and lateral public squares contribute to an artistic symmetric layout. Likewise, Cidade Gaúcha also adopted a linear design shaped by the access road on the main bridge and adjacent watercourses. Its gridded, hexagonally shaped plan imposed to the deforested site accommodates the main public buildings, the town hall, Catholic churches, and bus station, schools, in a symmetrical and strategic position in public squares at the crossing of perpendicular or diagonal tree-lined avenues. This was clearly intended to create striking perspectives and artistically customize the grid. A hybrid urbanism is noticeable in the plan of Maringá due to garden city principles. Straight orthogonal streets were thus integrated with the winding ones, which conform to the topographical contour of the site. The individuality of the town layout is mainly attributable to the site features as the city layout was molded around urban parks and preserving nearby streams. A predefined shape was avoided, even though the urban tissue is gridded in the civic center, where the terrain is flat and formality called for. A similar approach is evident in the Ivaipura plan, albeit with a more arbitrary shape intended to artistically adapt the grid to the site contours. The street width and the tree lining helped define the status and hierarchy of urban roads, and junctions have been understood as potential focal points for special treatment in order to create grand perspectives. Nevertheless, the rationalist discourse on urbanism excluded traditional planning and all kinds of explicitly formalist, inadequate to modern necessities. The form of the city was then defamiliarized and reformatted. The construction of Angelica put into practice the functional city idea in Brazil, paving the way for the disappearance of artistic features in the town layout. Functionally segregated, the rationalized grid organization conveyed a somewhat abstract layout. The rectangular, orthogonal, standardized residential sectors were planned according to the neighborhood unity concept and thus isolated pedestrians from vehicles. Artistic features were not present in this layout, and the mechanically applied open grid could be extended indefinitely as the city grows. Like many others, the positivist layout of Angelica classified, separated, ordered, and standardized the urban form for the machine age. Consequently, undistinguished gridded residential areas were created. The scientific approach of functionalist urbanism prevailed in Brazil since Brasilia. It worked to find the minimum elements of each urban function in order to achieve the simplest design solution, which was to be applied even to more complex situations. While the plan grid was then praised for being practical, rational, geometric, and abstract, the townscape inevitably was impoverished with the loss of individuality. Rurópolis, one of the several new towns designed in the Amazon basin in North Brazil in early 1970s, shows a similar approach. Its layout segregates the urban functions and shapes gridded residential areas, albeit less formally due to the site conditions. Public buildings were loosely scattered on the large, informal central open axis, so any kind of formal vista or artistic motive is absent. The notion of hierarchy and centrality was also rejected. In Sinop, low density, large urban plots, regular shapes, a grid pattern, a symmetrical arrangement of some diagonals, and ubiquitous roundabouts were adopted. On an absolutely flat terrain, the symmetrical grid was composed of very wide streets and avenues, ranging up to 50 meters in width, enhancing a horizontal, monotonous townscape. The vastness of Sinop can also be seen in Palmas, which is also a gridded city for the machine age. Its main urban axis, 150 meters wide, includes 2 avenues of 4 lanes each, plus parking areas on each side, a median strip, and compulsory setbacks. In addition to its surrounding natural setting, the gigantic grid, wide avenues, functional zoning, and the adaptation of the neighborhood unit concept are also notable features of the city. The town layout exhibited a relatively centrality, the administrative center, in an otherwise non-hierarchical linear form. City functions were segregated and residential areas were shaped in orthogonal macro blocks. To conclude, in the examples I have shown, the rectangular or square grid plan formed the initial template upon which designers could specialize the urban form by adapting it to topographical conditions and adding other morphological elements and artistic motifs for environmental, symbolic, and aesthetic purposes. All of the examples were of towns planned from scratch, but the lessons learned are also valid for urban expansion. The gridded spaces examined here were attuned to different cultural values and historical circumstances, but relate all to the quest of building better planned urban worlds. The results are compelling when the gridded urban form is treated as a defined, limited whole, regardless of shape and perimeter. The focus of the center is the arrangement of public buildings and open spaces, along with other formal motifs. There is systematic distinction apparent among the streets. Focal points break the uniform gridded plan, and an imaginative organization of urban elements comes into play. Sensitive design can thus mitigate the shortcomings of the urban grid model, and natural features and artistic composition can help specialize the grid. The arrangement of urban forms is not different from that of architectural composition and can be a fine expression of community life. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Rego. We have a question from, we have a couple of questions actually from our participants. And the first one is there a feature from earlier periods architecture that you would adopt for today's smart cities?
Oh, no, I think the architecture nowadays have to represent our times. So I don't think we could adopt old styles or late appearances. We need to create our own architecture right now.
Okay, thanks for that reply. And just one more question. As an architect, what do you think about smart cities?
Oh, I think this is a great solution. This is the solution for our times. I think we need to think about smart cities, and we need to think about connected space. And although we're talking about globalization and the flow of information, I think smart cities need to think about space with centrality, with focal points, in order to make better space and with ecological, environmental quality.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Rego. Thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.